Okay, so the next lesson is focused a bit on the West. This will be fairly short. These are older questions that I've used to help people think through this. What are the Confederacy's options and challenges? What do we make of Grant so far? By the end of 63, is the North winning? Does Confederacy, do they have a chance of winning the war? This is the overall situation, June 1, 1863. You'll notice the general disposition of Confederate forces: Pemberton with about 30,000 at Vicksburg, Johnson with about 25,000 outside. Grant has Vicksburg under siege. Has about 100,000 men spread up and down the Mississippi River. Banks of 24,000 men is in New Orleans. Rosecrans is 84,000, somewhat spread out. Burnside is occupying Kentucky. Hooker has about 115,000. There's several thousand, 20 or 30,000 troops scattered around Maryland, Pennsylvania, up to Harrisburg, Baltimore, and so on. The Confederate forces are somewhat more spread out. So you have about 55,000 men, Confederates here, but Pemberton, of course, is trapped in Vicksburg. You have Confederate forces scattered in Louisiana and Arkansas, Bragg with 45,000 in Tennessee. They will get reinforcements, in some measure of reinforcements. You have Buckner in eastern Tennessee because you have to keep Knoxville open for the railroads. Lee, of course, with 76,000. That's his, he's getting ready to move up into Pennsylvania. Beauregard, whose coastal defense duty, has about 16,000. He's responsible for the Carolinas and actually up to Petersburg. This is going to cause huge problems in the 64 campaign when Lee has to coordinate with him and ask him rather than order him to do things. And eventually Lee, this is one of the few times I think Lee actually is very blunt and direct with Davis, saying, yeah, you need to change this. I need direct operational control over Beauregard's troops. I can't be asking. This is ridiculous. So this is the overall situation. Not going to go through in big blow by blow the Vicksburg campaign, except this is what sort of makes Grant's reputation. They cut themselves, they let loose from their supply lines, at least temporarily. They go south of Vicksburg, then they cross the river, and then Grant defeats a series of Confederate armies. He catches them all spread out. Champions Hill is kind of the main this area. This is the largest engagement of the campaign. This is Grant, bold, maneuvering, taking chances, and then sort of bottling up Pemberton in Vicksburg. Now, the actual siege of Vicksburg lasts for a good while. There are various failed attempts to break in, which are repulsed. So, when you have massive earthworks with lots of cannon and rifled muskets, this is going to be pretty difficult to crack. This is where the war is going, increasingly. As time goes on, it becomes clear like they're just going to have to wait out Vicksburg, and eventually, what's going to happen? This is the end of the siege. You'll notice like not much has changed, but you'll notice different competing earthworks. Pemberton surrenders on July 4th, 1863. And then as we move into the autumn and into October, we have Chickamauga, which I'm not going to get into because that's really confusing. And the end result is that the Army of the Cumberland is forced back into Chattanooga, which is then put under siege. There's like one tenuous supply line into Chattanooga. And basically, you'll notice that the Confederate lines are very long. If you've ever been near Chattanooga, you'll have seen some of these things. The Confederate Army tries to keep the siege up well past when they should have retreated. Bragg stays with it. He stays with it. He stays with it. Chickamauga was the only victory the Confederacy won in the West, and it was kind of a useless victory. They took 18,000 casualties to inflict 14,000, and they didn't even destroy the Army of Cumberland. They just pushed them back. The initial plan had been to cut them off from Chattanooga, but Bragg has very little operational control or on-the-ground control of his generals. And then he keeps them there until basically it wasn't supposed to be this way, but it turns into a general assault along the line. Bragg's army basically disintegrates. Rosecrans is relieved. As you can see, Thomas is put in charge. Grant is in overall command. Hooker is now a corps commander. He was Army of the Potomac. He does very good service in the West. And so now the Confederate Army is in northern Georgia. The Union Army is in southern Tennessee. Now we're going to get set for what's going to be Sherman's Atlanta campaign. And so this is where we are when Grant, based on his string of victories, is appointed to command the armies of the United States and is going to take general overall command of Union forces. The plan for 64 is pretty simple. As you can see, most of the Confederacy is still intact. Yeah, the Union has now recovered Tennessee, but the bulk of the Confederacy is intact. Virginia is intact. The Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mobile is pretty much intact. Grant's idea, and of course the Trans-Mississippi Theater, which again, it's not that no one cares about it, but the war is going to be won or lost in this area. Grant's idea for 64 is to have 5 different armies jump off at the same time. They have the same start date for commencing operations. This will prevent the Confederacy from shifting forces around. Banks will take Mobile. Sherman will take Atlanta. Sigel will go down the Shenandoah Valley, which was a key agricultural supply line for Lee's army. Butler's Army of the James will come up out of Hampton and sever Lee's supply lines to North Carolina. Lee's army is basically supplied from 2 areas. It's supplied from the Shenandoah Valley and from North Carolina. If you take one and cut the other, Lee will not be able to supply his troops. And then Grant is going to go with Meade, and they're going to face off against Lee. And the objective is Lee's army. It's not to take Richmond. Threatening Richmond will force Lee to follow them, but the objective is Lee's army. Lincoln is very clear about that to Grant, and Grant and Lincoln are on the same page on that, and Grant impresses that upon Meade. Now, you will go wherever Lee goes. You have to close with the enemy. Yes, we're going to take casualties. You have to pin Lee's army down. If we're going to destroy it, and if failing that, we will pin it down and make sure it cannot conduct any more offensive operations. This is the plan in 64. So it is an interesting question to think about. Does the Confederacy have any chance of winning by 64? Twice Lee invades the North, first Maryland and then Pennsylvania, the Antietam campaign and the Gettysburg campaign, respectively. Both times there seems to be some expectation on his part and on Davis's part that a successful invasion of the North will prompt European powers to officially recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation state. And once that happens, it's going to be virtually inevitable that some kind of diplomatic solution to the war take place. But that doesn't happen. Lee's forced to withdraw in both cases, and in the Pennsylvania campaign, he's actually defeated on the battlefield. The other thing, of course, is that, as I said a couple lectures back, Confederate ambassadors to France and Britain are not top flight, really. They're not like the best people you want for the job. And the third thing has to do with the British ambassador to the United States and his rather fraught relationship with the U.S. Secretary of State William Seward. Seward would basically every week have these long sessions with the British ambassador, which consisted of him browbeating the British ambassador and basically saying effectively everything came down to simply this: Well, Her Majesty's government can do whatever it wants, but just remember the United States has a very long memory. Choose wisely. And at the end of the day, the Brits are just not willing to make that bet that the U.S. loses this war and the Confederacy wins. So they hedge their bets. They will not recognize the Confederacy. The other thing as well, and we know this now from studying internal British government memos, is that there never was any chance of a British army being sent over to the Confederacy to help fight. There's not going to be any expeditionary force. In fact, Lord Palmerston's government, the Prime Minister, was it Prime Minister at the time? I think so. Didn't even want there to be any naval cooperation. British Navy ships were under instructions not to even appear to cooperate with Confederate naval vessels. The British do not want any part of this. And so in a global history sense, it is interesting that the Brits do decide to intervene in the Taiping Civil War, but they don't decide to intervene in the American Civil War. A lot of that has to do with the fact that, Britain doesn't figure on any global repercussions for interfering in Chinese government affairs. They're not willing to make that bet with the American government. So, with European support dwindling, the U.S. naval blockade increasing, the Confederacy being cut in two along the Mississippi, does the Confederacy have a chance of winning as you head into 1864? It's an open question to think about.